that was just practice. I'm going to call the Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources to order. Before we actually begin, and I make some statements, I'd like to take a little bit of time to reflect, or maybe to really have some more silence on, to me, where the shock of the loss of Chairman Cummings and the passing that we just learned about just prior to the hearing. A giant, highly respected, and it just seems like we're going through this great transition in many ways in our society. That's why we actually have panelists to talk about what are the pathways in this transition. Well, he was a giant from an era that presently so needed that understanding, and that whole generation is becoming seniors, and it's very sad. You just think of him, I just think of him as always being here, always being a dynamic leader, giant, and it's so sad. And you can't replace that. That set of experiences is what really brought us to many places today, and so we're going to miss him just for what he brings to the Congress, and so I'm very sad. Just want to say that.
And I would also like to echo the words of my colleague, and it's a sad day when we lose one of our friends, and although we may have political differences at times, we often realize that there are things much more important than politics. And today, our hearts are with the Cummings family, and lift them up in our thoughts and prayers.
Thank you. Well, now, I'm very excited about today's hearing because the subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on realistic pathways to address the climate crisis. And I think that's such a critical point that, we're going to hopefully talk about some things that really help us move along, that you can demonstrate, provide us with some background in terms of what's going on out in the communities. We're now thinking about what role the federal government should or should not play. What you're going to be telling us is critically important in terms of how do we get there. I think we're kind of moving all in that direction. So we're here to hear testimonies on realistic pathways to address the climate crisis. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at the hearing are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member. I'm going to ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they're submitted to the subcommittee clerk by 5 p.m. today. Hearing no objection, that's so ordered. I'm going to ask unanimous over the next several weeks, we have seen an extraordinary level of activism from young people across the United States and around the world. We all had visitors here. People. It was quite a moving experience to see the rise of young people coming here, asking us to deal with the climate crisis, in a more urgent way. And they wanted us to take bold action, follow the science, and the message was impossible to miss. The science is overwhelmingly clear that our planet and our society is facing irreparable harm. If we don't take strong action soon to reduce greenhouse gas pollution, according to the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the world's foremost group of climate scientists, we must have come out clearly in saying we must achieve net zero emissions globally. And now we're not even talking about we're talking about globally by mid-century at the latest to avoid the worst potential impacts of climate change. What they're saying is that if we ever want to even hold it to 1.5 degrees centigrade, And that's not a success, just holding it. It's still going to increase between where it is. We must take dramatic steps, and if we don't, it's going to get worse than that. And so we must reduce greenhouse gas pollution. Well, I think it's also important to note that net zero, and when they're talking about reaching net zero by mid-century, that's not an absolute zero. In other words, this is a two-front war. While we need to fight both simultaneously. More success in one eases the pressure on the other. We'll be talking about that a little bit more. First, we must reduce greenhouse gas pollution dramatically. More renewables, higher efficiency, better energy storage, less methane leakage, smarter grid. Those are some of the challenges that we face on one hand. But we also have to take more carbon out of the atmosphere. The good news is that that's where nature really helps us. In 2014, U.S. forests and soils absorbed 762 million metric tons of carbon dioxide. The bad news is that we emitted 9 times more than that. Better land management, forest protection, new carbon removing technologies can help us on this front. So if achieving net zero sounds like a difficult goal, that is because it really is a difficult goal. The number of cars on the road, our heavy industries, our building stock, I could go on and on of all these realities of modern life that make this a monumentally challenging task, but it is not impossible. Achieving net zero will take a massive mobilization and a coordination across many different levels of government and the private sector. But why should a challenge like this, a challenge to mobilize like this, stop us? We're a nation that mobilized against the threat of fascism, and we won the Second World War. We put astronauts on the moon and successfully brought them home. When we learned of the destructive effects of acid rain on our landscapes, Congress amended the Clean Air Act, and we cut sulfur dioxide emissions by 88%. When we learned that chlorofluorocarbons were dissolving the ozone layer, we came together with every single country in the UN to ratify the Montreal Protocol, phasing out those chemicals and beginning to heal the ozone hole. This is not a time to lose hope in the ability of the American people to lead the world in addressing humanity's biggest challenges. Testimony from today's witnesses will provide a snapshot of policies that can help guide and inspire our own efforts and on this committee to help the federal government, and specifically the Department of Interior, reach net zero emissions on a science-based, realistic timeline. Before returning to the ranking member, Westerman's, for his opening statements, I'd like to reiterate something I said at the start of the year. I want this subcommittee to be a forum where we discuss the issues and develop legislative solutions that have a buy-in from our communities across the nation. We all come from different districts. We represent different constituencies with different ideas about the best way to move our country forward. There is no silver bullet policy that's going to save the day. Meeting the immense challenges ahead will require as many solutions as possible on the table. And it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to be up to all of us to come through with thoughtful solutions that meet our climate goals while also preserving the well-being of our constituents. I hope that today's hearing lends a thoughtful leads, maybe not even lends itself, but also leads to a thoughtful and respectful discussion based on facts and with an eye towards finding agreement whenever possible. I now recognize Ranking Member Westerman with his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to the witnesses here today. I'm actually filling in for Ranking Member Gosar, and I apologize for being a little bit late to get the meeting started. But today the subcommittee will discuss pathways to achieving climate optimism and someday potentially net zero emissions for the United States. I agree that renewable energy production on our federal lands is an important component of all the above energy strategy, and innovations like carbon capture and sequestration are promising. However, I caution that we need to stay on a good path to get to these objectives, but if we make rash decisions without considering all the alternative effects, and we could be moving too quickly sometimes. So we need to do this with common sense and reason, and continue to develop innovation and research and development, looking at all sources and fuels that are out there. I find the title of this hearing very exciting. I agree with my colleagues that there is a case for climate optimism, and I believe that optimism stems from American innovation, from common sense and sound leadership and policies that should be coming from Congress. While we have seen significant growth in the renewable energy sector in recent years, global demand will require the use of conventional fuels for decades to come. World energy consumption is expected to nearly double by 2050, and consumption of natural gas will likely increase more than 40%. We can assume that China, India, and other major polluters will continue using fossil fuels, emitting carbon and greenhouse gases and growing their economies. And while renewables like solar and wind are more cost-effective than they once were, an over-reliance would still have a huge impact on the average American household. We need to make all of our fuels as clean as possible and utilize our largest environmental filter, our forest, to their full potential, and I appreciate you mentioning that, Mr. Chairman. And I can tell you that we're continually seeing new innovations and American companies doing things to address this issue. I just met with a group this morning who are building 2 new LNG-powered ships that will be some of the lowest emission vessels on the planet. So we're making progress. We're doing some of the right things, and it's through innovation that has given us an abundant supply of clean, low-cost natural gas that's really helping us to reduce a lot of emissions. Additionally, I think we can't have tunnel vision. We can't get too focused on a particular fuel. We have to look at all fuels and think, how can we make these fuels cleaner, and how can we make our energy systems reliable? During the polar vortex in the Midwest last winter, wind turbines weren't able to produce power, and utilities had to offset those losses with natural gas and coal. A lack of sufficient battery storage and transmission capacity means renewable sources can't be stored in large quantities like coal or natural gas, requiring baseload power. Without reliable conventional energy sources, communities are subject to rolling blackouts, endangering the health and safety of our local communities. I mentioned earlier that I believe there is a case for climate optimism. It is called American innovation. Everyone here wants to maintain healthy lands and waters, as many of my Republican colleagues in particular live in rural areas. But just look at domestic emission trends from energy production over the past decades. In 2017, U.S. carbon emissions were the lowest since 1992, and per capita emissions reached the lowest level since 1950. While alternative energy sources are a contributing factor, emissions reductions are largely due to industry innovations to improve efficiency, combined with the growth in natural gas production enabled by fracking technology. In fact, only 2% of greenhouse emissions in the U.S. are from natural gas. Robust American production contributes to a cleaner global energy market as well. Domestically sourced oil, gas, and coal are lower in emissions and significantly more efficient than energy resources produced elsewhere. For instance, Russian LNG is 13% dirtier than American-produced LNG. Foreign nations will satisfy their energy markets one way or another, and meeting as much of this demand as possible with American resources could yield economic and environmental benefits worldwide. So, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to the testimony, and I look forward to the discussion following, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Westerman. I'm now going to introduce today's panel of witnesses. First, Hector de la Torre is a board member of the California Air Resources Board, a state agency which is charged with developing programs to fight climate change and to reduce air pollution. I'd like to take this opportunity to say I served with Hector de la Torre, or Hector really to me, and his wife Tina, who's here, for many years in the state legislature. I think it was from 2004 to 2010 we served together. Hector was my assembly member, and we worked together on lots of issues, so I have a personal, deep affection and friendship for Hector. Welcome to the committee, Hector. Next, we have Gianna Amador, who is the co-founder and the managing director of Carbon 180, which is a nonprofit that works to develop policies and promote research into carbon removal. Next, we have Ann Kelly, who is the Vice President of Government Relations at Cirrus, which is a nonprofit working with investors and companies to take action on climate change and sustainability challenges. And finally, we have Douglas Holtz-Eakin, President of the American Action Forum. I'm going to be a little bit more liberal on this, because normally I say, but there's not a lot, we're going to keep everybody to 5 minutes. When the red light, when you start talking, the green light will come on after 4 minutes. We're going to keep doing that. The orange light will come on, and then after 5 minutes, the red light. And I hope you watch that, but I'm going to give you a little extra time as you go on, because I don't think we have to worry about interrupting the flow from the other members of Congress.
Do multiple rounds.
So we can do multiple rounds, and Bruce and I are looking forward to it. So I know you've all prepared, and so we'll go with that. So I'm going to recognize now Mr. De La Torre for his testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, my congressman, not literally, but we have served together, and it was an honor to serve with you. California's Air Resources Board predates the United States Environmental Protection Agency and has spent over 50 years improving air quality and reducing emissions for stationary and mobile sources. Today, California's economy is the 5th largest in the world, and our gross state product has grown considerably faster than the national rate. This combination of environmental improvement and economic growth has drawn other states and countries, such as China and several in Europe, to see what we do and how. Environmental and economic progress have happened hand in hand. California's economy-wide climate legislation, the Global Warming Solutions Act, was signed over 10 years ago by Governor Schwarzenegger, and both the chair and myself voted for it. This law requires a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels by 2020, which we have met each of the last 2 years, way ahead of schedule. Then in 2016, the legislature and Governor Jerry Brown followed up by setting a 2030 target of 40% below 1990 levels. This is the mandate California is working under now. Our greenhouse gas emissions dropped below the 2020 target for the first time in 2016, staying below this target in 2017, and per capita greenhouse gas emissions dropped almost 25% between 2001 and 2018. Over this period, our economy has continued to show significant growth, disproving the notion that economic growth is inextricably linked to greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, we saw gross state product increase by over 50% during this time period. This level of climate ambition and commitment across different administrations, both Democratic and Republican, and the legislature has sent the critical market signals to attract private investment in low-carbon fuels and technologies. Importantly, our near and long-term goals require action across all sectors, and California uses a portfolio approach that includes renewable electricity, an economy-wide cap-and-trade program, renewable fuels, zero or near-zero emission vehicles, energy efficiency, protection of our natural and working lands, and even our waste sector. Electricity is the linchpin of our activity and required immediate attention. In 2018, 42% of California's electricity load was served by renewable resources. Of this renewable electricity, 29% comes from hydroelectric, 27% from wind, 27% from solar, and 17% from other renewable sources like geothermal and biomass. This is in contrast to 2011, in which 27% of load was served by renewable electricity, a significant growth in a fairly short amount of time. Notably, the state looks at not only the in-state generation of electricity, but all electricity generated to serve California's customers. About 32% of our electricity comes from outside the state. Since the start of our cap-and-trade program in 2013, the electricity sector greenhouse gas emissions have been reduced by more than 30%, caused by increasing procurement of renewable power under the state's renewables portfolio standard, utilities divesting of coal power, and the addition of a carbon price to greenhouse gas emissions, which influences the dispatch of electricity. California's renewable portfolio standard program initially required that 30% of retail electricity sales be served by renewable resources by 2020. The renewables portfolio standard applies to all electricity retailers in the state. In 2017, when utilities had a 27% renewables portfolio target, utilities either met or exceeded the target. In fact, California now reaches 50% of power consumed from renewables on occasion. The renewables requirement was increased to 60% by 2030 and 100% by 2045 by Governor Jerry Brown. In addition to energy production, energy efficiency, and other demand-side programs balance the energy equation. Per capita sales of electricity in California have been mostly flat since the 1970s, with a trend downward in recent years. This downward trend is primarily due to continued progress in building and appliance standards and incentive programs that encourage voluntary customer adoption of solar and energy efficiency measures. The California Solar Initiative has transformed solar markets and continues to manage demand. Though the solar panel rebate in California was phased out in 2014, there has been little impact on the market due to contributions of net energy metering and the federal tax credit playing a large role in continued growth and market transformation. Despite U.S. tariffs on panels manufactured in China, California continues to see growth, which is evidenced by the state reaching its millionth behind-the-meter solar installation this year. The transportation sector accounts for about 50% of California's greenhouse gas emissions when considering both tailpipe emissions and emissions associated with upstream processing and production of petroleum fuels. California is absolutely committed on passenger vehicles and goods movement, as you might have heard. We are making significant progress with vehicle emissions for internal combustion cars and trucks, as well as zero-emission vehicles. Nearly 10% of new vehicle purchases in the state are electric, with that number expected to continue to increase. Funding the growth of charging infrastructure provides the backbone for transportation electrification to take off, augmented by rebates, more variety in the types of vehicles by almost every auto manufacturer, and increasing consumer acceptance of alternative fuel vehicles. We use California Climate Investments, monies from our cap-and-trade program and administered by the California Air Resources Board, to move clean technology forward and spread the benefits throughout the state. The California Air Resources Board has allocated about $4.2 billion to date, and much of the funding has supported transportation electrification via investment in battery electric, fuel cell electric, and plug-in hybrid technologies. In addition, the California Public Utilities Commission has authorized $1 billion in spending for transportation electrification infrastructure through 2023. These proposals include providing 48,000 additional charging stations in Southern California, pilot programs to install light-duty infrastructure at schools, state parks, and beaches, and a pilot to install infrastructure at low and moderate income residences. In its 11th year, the California Energy Commission's Clean Transportation Program has awarded over $800 million toward advanced clean transportation and alternative fuels. With regard to fuels, the Low Carbon Fuel Standard Program is one of the key measures designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation in California and to diversify the fuel pool to reduce petroleum dependency. The program sets annual carbon intensity standards or benchmarks, which reduce over time for gasoline, diesel, and the fuels that replace them. Since 2011, renewable biodiesel use has increased 7,000%, reducing emissions of toxic pollutants as well as greenhouse gas and providing consumers with cleaner fuel choices. I referenced California's cap-and-trade program, which complements targeted sectoral efforts. The cap-and-trade program is an economy-wide, market-based program that sets a cap on annual greenhouse gas emissions from regulated sources and declines each year, putting a limit on total emissions from all covered sources and supporting a steadily increasing carbon price to incentivize greenhouse gas reductions. Around 450 businesses responsible for about 85% of California's total greenhouse gas emissions are in the program. We have partners in the program in the Canadian province of Quebec, and we are open to other states joining us as they do on our vehicle standards under the Federal Clean Air Act. A sign of the market power of the cap-and-trade mechanism is the steadily increasing carbon price, which incentivizes businesses to invest in actions to reduce their emissions. The carbon price also favors procurement of lower carbon power through long-term contracts because businesses have confidence in our ongoing and strong commitment to greenhouse gas reduction. California seeks to meet our climate, air quality, and public health goals using a variety of programs, as I've cited. These achieve emissions reductions while ensuring economic flexibility and specific reductions in key emitting sectors. Our steadfast commitment to protecting public health and supporting clean fuels and clean tech continues to attract private investment, innovation, and create jobs in the state. Key programs such as the Renewables Portfolio Standard, Low Carbon Fuel Standard, Cap and Trade Program, and Advanced Clean Cars spur economic activity across energy and manufacturing sectors. The cost of inaction is too high, and California is working to ensure that steps are taken to mitigate these risks with strategies that are effective from an environmental and economic perspective. After all, what is wrong with cheaper and cleaner? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. De La Torre. Ms. Amador, you're welcome to the committee.
Thank you. Good morning to members of the committee, and thank you for your invitation to testify. I'm the founder and managing director of Carbon 180, a nonprofit working to foster a prosperous economy that removes more carbon from the atmosphere than we emit. We must take bold and sweeping action to drive U.S. emissions to net zero by 2050. Meeting this target will not only take rapid emissions reductions, but also the removal of carbon from the atmosphere. Carbon removal includes natural and technological solutions, from farming in more sustainable ways and to building machines that pull carbon dioxide directly from the air. These solutions represent an opportunity to build a larger toolbox in the fight against climate change, to offset for difficult to decarbonize sectors like aviation and shipping, and to reach our climate goals swiftly. By deploying mature solutions today and developing the solutions of the future, the U.S. federal government and this committee will play a vital role in halting the climate crisis while realizing significant environmental and economic benefits. The land sector is already a powerful tool to fight climate change. Together, U.S. forests, wetlands, and agriculture lands sequester an amount roughly equal to 11% of annual U.S. emissions, a capacity that could be doubled if we take steps today to bolster and scale the land carbon sink. These solutions are low cost and come with a number of co-benefits like clean water, enhanced biodiversity, decreased fire risk, and flood protection. To fulfill this potential, the federal government should take steps towards harnessing the power of our public lands. Together, the Bureau of Land Management and the United States Forest Service manage 258 million acres of forests. The biggest barrier today to increasing forest carbon stocks on these lands is funding for restoration projects. The U.S. Forest Service only reforests about 120,000 acres per year, despite having a backlog of more than 10 million acres worth of unfunded projects. While the 2018 omnibus spending package took a first step towards supporting the restoration capacity of federal agencies, dedicated funding for forest restoration must be expanded if we are to reach our 2050 climate goals. Not only should we expand our forests, but we must also protect the carbon they store from wildfires, which is one of the many dangers presented by climate change. Specifically, Congress can increase agency capacity for safe and responsible prescribed burning, increase and create financial incentives for the removal of hazardous biomass from federal lands through Bureau of Land Management stewardship contracts, and finally, reduce barriers for the U.S. Forest Service and Department of Interior agencies to coordinate and share resources on forest management. Beyond forests, our agriculture lands can also be a key lever to drive decarbonization. Farming practices like no and low tillage, cover crops, compost application, and optimal grazing management can store carbon in our soils while also increasing on-farm yield and building resilience to climate impacts. Based on Carbon 180's direct engagement with farmers across the U.S., we recommend that Congress support farmers operating on private land by fully funding the USDA's Conservation Stewardship Program and Environmental Quality Incentives Program. In addition, they should bolster the technical assistance capacity of the Natural Resources Conservation Service. On public lands, the Bureau of Land Management should support carbon storage on the 155 million acres of federal land used for livestock grazing. Providing preferential leasing rates to ranchers who implement carbon storing practices is one potential pathway to incentivize adoption while also supporting ranchers' bottom lines. Alongside the deployment of natural solutions, technology-based solutions can help us reach the scale of carbon removal indicated by the climate science. One of the most promising technology-based solutions is called direct air capture. It separates carbon dioxide from the ambient air to be stored underground or in commercial products like building materials, fuels, and plastics. These solutions provide a significant economic opportunity to create businesses, jobs, and markets that fight climate change. Our analysis estimates that in the U.S. alone, there is a $1 trillion total available market for the conversion of carbon dioxide into low and negative emissions products. Direct air capture may be a new technology, but we've already seen a significant drop in costs and increased deployment over the last decade. Today, there are nearly a dozen small-scale plants, with plans for one of these to scale up to capture a full 500,000 tons of carbon dioxide per year. Federal innovation and deployment policy must keep pace if we are to scale up these technologies in time to meet our mid-century climate goals. While the jurisdiction of this committee does not focus on R&D, the committee can support the other two Ds, demonstration and deployment. It can work with the private sector to deploy first-of-a-kind projects on public lands. Just as this committee supported the development of over 15,000 megawatts of renewable energy, it can support the responsible and efficient deployment of direct air capture and direct ocean capture projects. These are just a few of the levers that this committee and the federal government can pull to unlock our 2050 climate goals, while also supporting healthy ecosystems and thriving economies. As Congress considers taking action on climate, we recommend engagement with a broad set of participants, including environmental organizations, labor unions, indigenous peoples, frontline communities, and companies, in order to create durable, equitable, and effective climate policy. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Amador. Next, Ann Kelly, the Vice President of Government Relations at Cirrus. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you. Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Westerman, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm Vice President for Government Relations at Ceres, where I direct the Business for Innovative Climate and Energy Policy, BICEP Network, a group of 55 major U.S. companies committed to advocating for ambitious climate and clean energy policies. Climate change is the most significant threat to the U.S. economy today. To mitigate this threat, the science is clear. We must limit global average temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which requires the world to reduce emissions to net zero by 2050. If we act now, we can avoid the worst impacts of a warming world and strengthen our economy at the same time. A 2019 World Economic Forum report ranked extreme weather, natural disasters, and failure of governments to act on climate change as 3 of the 5 greatest risks to business. In 2017, 153 billion hours of labor were lost worldwide from heat exposure, an increase of 62 billion hours lost relative to the year 2000. Also in 2017, 3 major storms, Harvey, Irma, and Maria, together cost the United States economy over $265 billion and collectively cost over 3,100 lives. The risks of climate change are sobering, and the challenge of reaching net zero is real. But companies are taking action. They've done the math. They've seen risk to their business from a changing climate and cost savings of investing in low-carbon technologies and practices. They feel pressure from employees, customers, and investors concerned about financial risk and corporate responsibility. But mostly, they're taking action simply because it makes financial sense to do so. Corporate America, which is laser-focused on the bottom line, is procuring record amounts of clean energy and clean transportation and working with their supply chains to reduce their extended emissions. Increasingly, these efforts are tied to net zero targets. In 2018, global corporate power purchase agreements for renewable energy set a record of 13.6 gigawatts. 2019 will surpass that number. 204 major global companies, including 3M, eBay, Kellogg's, Google, Nike, Target, and Adobe, have committed to sourcing 100% of their energy from renewable electricity. Over 650 companies have committed to align their operations with a 2-degree world, and 100 of those, including Amazon, Mars, Levi's, and Salesforce, have committed to aligning their businesses with a 1.5-degree world. Many power companies are doing the same. Xcel, AEP, NRG, and Duke have set targets to eliminate emissions from power generation by mid-century. In fact, a new study finds that the US-based green economy generates more than $1.3 trillion annually and employs roughly 4% of the US workforce. But on their own, corporate commitments are not enough. A comprehensive, science-based policy response from Congress is essential for the US to reach net zero emissions by 2050. This response should begin with a binding net zero emissions target. The cornerstone policy should be a technology-neutral price on carbon that puts all energy sources on a level playing field, which companies in all sectors actually support. In fact, 75 companies with a presence in all 50 states joined the Ceres Bicep Network and came to Capitol Hill last spring to call for a strong price on carbon, and they will be back next year. The Bicep Network is pleased to see bipartisan support on climate and clean energy, including Ranking Member Gosar's Public Lands Renewable Energy Development Act and the many recent Republican-sponsored carbon pricing proposals. In addition to a price on carbon, Congress should support a portfolio approach of standards, R&D investments, necessary regulations, incentives, targeting the 5 sectors responsible for the majority of our emissions: power, transportation, buildings, industry, and land use. Finally, climate change is a global problem that requires a global solution. The U.S. must remain in the Paris Climate Agreement. Businesses and investors agree. Over 2,200 of them, including Microsoft, Walmart, JLL, DuPont, and Citi, are members of the We Are Still In coalition, a network of real economy actors supporting continued U.S. participation in the Paris Agreement. We take an unacceptable risk to the U.S. economy and the quality of life for future generations by not acting on climate change immediately. The private sector is taking action on its own and is calling on lawmakers to enact new and ambitious policies. Now is the time for Congress to act, and know that business has your back. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Kelly. Now finally we have Douglas Holtz-Eakin, President of the American Action Forum, which is a nonprofit thinking tank again. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Gosar, and members of the committee for the chance to be here today. As I noted in my written statement, I don't share the optimism of reaching net zero over 10 years. That's informed largely by research that we did at AAF earlier this year, which looked at the cost of reaching net zero in generating electricity, and that cost over 10 years turned out to be $5.7 trillion, despite the fact that we stacked the deck in favor of making it as easy as possible to get there. We assumed that you could actually generate all day with solar, generate all night with wind, that electricity demand was flat, that we used all of the hydroelectric resources that the United States had, and a variety of other assumptions that really made it easier to get to net zero over 10, and it still turned out to be really quite expensive. The annual cost would exceed the current total sales of electricity in the United States, and that's just the cost of installing the capacity. The operations of that would be more expensive as well. MIT research suggests that it would be somewhere between 40 and 280% more expensive than currently. So this is a very, very, very expensive, not particularly realistic target in my view. 10 years is just too quick. And these costs matter. They matter, I think, in a couple of different ways. First, they are costs to the U.S. economy, and those are important considerations. But I think the bigger impact is outside the United States, where we're the second largest emitter of greenhouse gases, but we have only about 15% of the global total. A third of it's in emerging economies that will not bear those kinds of costs easily, and they will be reluctant to join any effort if that's the cost they have to pay. And so I think if you look at the success of any effort on climate change, it will require strong U.S. leadership, and that leadership should be leadership in efficient, low-cost approaches to doing that. And on that front, I am more optimistic because I think a strategy based on market incentives and innovation can accomplish those goals. And I want to thank the chairman for mentioning at the outset the Acid Rain program. I spent 1989, 1990 at the White House Council of Economic Advisors working on that program. It was an enormous success and was, in fact, the first time we harnessed market forces in a powerful way to address a pressing emissions problem. And that strategy can be repeated. Elements of that strategy do include additional investments by the federal government in the basic research that lead to breakthrough technologies. As Mr. Mesterman mentioned in his remarks, we've seen enormous improvements just because of hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling. The initial investments for that were made by the Department of Energy beginning in the 70s, and it was ultimately commercialized in very successfully by the private sector. That's a recipe we need to repeat to be successful in this regard. We've seen some important action that can be improved and extended in the Fed Act initiative and also ARPA-E. And I want to echo some of the previous panelists' call for technology-neutral approaches. And so, we have about $110 billion a year in energy subsidies. Those should be reformed to be technology-neutral and to not pick particular sources or technologies. And the same will be true for loan programs. But I'm pleased to be here today, and I will wrap up here in the hopes of getting to net zero overrun, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much. Well, now I want to thank the panel for their statements, and now I think we're going to move towards questions. I'm going to ask I was going to say before, ask the panelists or the members of the dais to limit their questions, but since there's only the three of us, I'm not going to do that today. I will accept the fact that you're all responsible and you'll limit by yourself without the chair asking you to limit. So let's go on let's start with some questions. My first one is as I'm going to my questions, I'm struck with some of the things that came up, I think, at the end, and I want to kind of understand, I think it was the question that was just recently raised by Dr. Holtz-Eakin, who talked about the enormous costs that this will do. And so you're looking at one side, just what it's going to cost to change the economy to move towards a net zero emission, how much? The other question, but I want you, Mr. De La Torre, to kind of respond to the fact that California, which is the most aggressive state, or among the most aggressive state, you have indicated and has spent a significant amount of resources, raised money already with its cap and trade program and done it. Yet your economy keeps growing at a very fast rate. So this argument, just in terms of the costs of investment, may not be real clear for us in terms of what is the outcome of that investment, and is that helping the economy tremendously also to do this kind of investment? And so cost is definitely on one side, but all businesses have to invest in the future. And is this a good investment that's going to help them make money in the future? Mr. De La Torre.
Disincentive for efficiency. And that's what we're talking about here. Mm-hmm. It's the more efficient use of resources. I referenced in my comments, California's gross state product is growing faster than the nation's, about 46% versus 35% of the rest of the country since 2000. The same exact time period that we were making all of this progress on environmental standards, on reducing greenhouse gases and other pollutants. It's very important from a public health perspective to recognize that we're not just talking about some ephemeral global phenomenon. We're also talking about people who live in these communities where this pollution is happening and it's impacting their health. And there is a cost to that, to society. In terms of costs, I think it's hard to project in this space because it's a moving target. And it's a moving target in a good way. It's moving down. Using 2008 as a base year, costs for solar, both utility and distributed solar, batteries, and LEDs have reduced between 40 and 90%. So there are market mechanisms at work here driving costs down as demand goes up. Electric vehicle costs are going down because those batteries are cheaper. So it is hard to say today in 2019 what the costs for these things are going to be in 2030. We know that the current trajectories are very, very positive. The cost is being driven down, and those investments that you referenced that California has been making is actually creating the market for these products and making them cheaper so that the rest of the country and the rest of the world can adopt those technologies. So we are creating green tech in California by these investments. Yes, we need it for ourselves, but at the end of the day, when those prices come down, other folks are going to use them as well.
Thank you. I think in kind of...
If I could?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't think there's that big a difference across this table. The biggest difference is time. Mm-hmm. He talked about California having been at it for 50 years. Time matters. 50 is time for adjustment that's much better than 10. And the breadth of the effort. It's concentrating it solely on the renewables and not having access to other ways to limit emissions over time that makes this such a costly policy. So it's really not that different. I'm certainly one who's going to preach on the virtues of markets in cutting costs, delivering efficiencies, and being the right way to do this.
Well, let me follow up on this discussion in that it was indicated, and you talked about, you know, this 10-year plan, which you see is just not really feasible.
Right.
I was just struck with following up on that, was that in the staff report that we received, and in I think in much, we talked about, I think it's the, is it the ICPP report? IPCC report. And that talked about really setting 2050 as a goal to keep it. Yet California, as I look at it, has set 2045 really to get to net zero. The question I'm asking is do we have data to indicate that we can do it faster than this? You're saying we can't do it that fast. 10 years is not possible. What do you think? Do you think we could follow California's lead and set a net zero at 2045? Because what we're really talking about, the reason I raise that, is that we have, if we have a responsibility to do this, and the United States of all the nations in the world can do it, if we're saying for the globe, you have to have it, and you want to keep it at 1.5 for the globe by 2050, somebody had better demonstrate that you can do it faster than that, because there are going to be some slower folks. Why aren't we setting the highest standard, or the highest, even though, and looking at going faster? Because there are a lot of places, if we're now really concerned about a global effect, there are a lot of places that don't have the ability to do what we're doing as quickly as we're doing, and yet they're going to pollute also. Maybe not to the extent that the United States does, but they too have to move forward. And so I'm just saying, if 10 years is too small, California says they can do it at 2020, net zero. Is that possible?
So I would say the honest answer is I don't know how fast the United States can do it. But I do know that it will be driven by the kinds of innovation that are simply difficult to anticipate and forecast, and that's why I can't give you the answer. Those will be delivered most rapidly and most ambitiously by something which gives a firm market signal, like a price on carbon, and has a very efficient policy. And I think that as a matter of leadership on this issue, the U.S. should focus on highly innovative strategies that deliver a low-cost solution, because other countries won't jump on if it looks like it's going to be very expensive and hurt their economies. And so the honest answer about how fast we get there, I don't know. What they learned is that their initial targets got met, so they revised them and got there quicker. That could happen in the U.S. as well, but it's going to depend on the quality of the policy.
I'm going to yield back because I believe we'll probably have a second round, and I'll go to Mrs. Amador. First, I now turn to Representative Westerman for 5 minutes, or whatever you believe is appropriate.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I really appreciate having this hearing today and to be able to talk about some of these subjects in a rational manner. And I mentioned forest in my testimony. It's been brought up a lot in my opening statement. It's been brought up a lot in the testimony. Many of you have probably seen a report, a research paper that was done by some Swiss researchers that said that if we planted 1 trillion trees across the globe, we could greatly reduce the impact of carbon emissions. That's a very bold ambition, but in theory, it's got, I think, a lot of merit to it from the standpoint of recognizing that trees are what I called our natural filter. Teddy Roosevelt said that trees are the lungs of the earth, and I would also add that trees are the kidneys of the earth. We measure environmental cleanness by air quality and water quality, and the linchpin between those two are the forest. Forests, through photosynthesis, take in carbon dioxide, and they give off oxygen, and they end up storing carbon in their stems and their limbs, their leaves and their roots, to the equivalent of about 50% of the mass of the dry mass of a tree is carbon. Trees also filter and clean water. Over 2/3 of the drinking water in the United States comes from forested areas. So I think we may be selling this ace in the hole a little bit short with the opportunities that we have while we do research, while we try to make existing fuels cleaner, while we try to make renewable fuels more efficient and more cost-effective. We've really got an offensive weapon here and a pragmatic approach that I believe we can take to address climate issues. Now, on the matter of 1 trillion trees, if you look at U.S. Forest Service data, they say in the United States we've got about 300 billion trees total that account for about 1 trillion cubic feet of wood mass. So when you talk about 1 trillion trees, you're talking about more than 3 times the amount of trees that currently stand in the United States at this time. But there's a key component there in that 1 trillion cubic feet and 300 billion trees. That means that the average tree is about 3.33 cubic feet per tree. And if you can visualize that, that's something, around a 5 or 6 inch diameter tree, about 25 or 30 feet tall, depending on the form of the tree. So that tells us that the trees that we have here on average are relatively small. And we know that research says that the larger the trees we can get growing on an acre, the better they are at storing carbon. So we've got tremendous opportunity just in making our current forest healthier, getting larger trees on our current forest. And that's a lot of what we've been trying to drive through forest policy, through the fire funding fix, to give the Forest Service more opportunity to do management. But there's also another problem. We've got the 300 billion trees we've got, way over supply of the markets that we've got for those trees. So, and there's research that shows that the more demand there are for wood products, the more likely we are to keep more land forested. In my home state of Arkansas, we produce about 16 million more tons of fiber every year than what we consume. So our forests are continuing to add a net increment. We're doing our part on storing carbon, but we've got to, I think, address the issue of markets. And there's some exciting things out there. The University of Arkansas, where I went to undergraduate school, they recently built 2 mass timber wooden dormitories. They built a mass timber library storage building. They're storing several tons of carbon in those buildings. And just up the road from the University of Arkansas, Walmart has recently announced that when they build their new corporate headquarters, they're going to build it out of mass timber construction. So I think businesses are seeing the benefit of doing things in a more sustainable way. But I think as we look at policy, we've got to figure out how we address the issue of forest, from one, making our existing forest healthier and allowing them to utilize their full growing potential to sequester more carbon. We've got to figure out how to get marginal lands reforested so that we're increasing the amount of land. And then we've got to figure out how to get more carbon in things like this dais, where it's stored for as long as this dais is here, and where it's stored in buildings. So my question is, from a forestry standpoint, what do you think Congress could be doing to incentivize more forestation, more use of wood products? And there's another component to that. On the renewable energy, biomass, I think, has to be a component of that. So, Ms. Amador, you probably talked more about forests, so I'm going to throw that out there to you, and I appreciate the chairman giving us some leeway on time here.
So to build the carbon storing capacity of our forests, Congress has a number of options. I think the first is to encourage forest restoration by fully funding the reforestation capacity of the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management. The second is to protect the existing carbon that's stored in our forests from wildfires by providing more money for off-season prescribed burning, by altering the Bureau of Land Management stewardship contract so that we can actually get people to remove hazardous biomass that basically provides kindling for our wildfires. And then 3, support resource sharing between the agencies that are currently fighting fire, namely the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management.
Okay, I want to interrupt right there. You talked about reforestation in the Forest Service, which is extremely important. In August, I was able to go out and visit some of the forest around Lake Tahoe, which is a very sensitive watershed. And the name of the fire is slipping me, but it was 12 years ago. It looks like the fire happened last summer. The Forest Service told me I think they had replanted it 5 or 6 times. But because of the severity of that wildfire, the regeneration wasn't taking place. But from where we viewed this fire damage, there was a healthy forest that had been thinned and managed before the fire came through. It's still a healthy forest that's doing its job of cleaning the air and cleaning the water, and it's not costing the taxpayer a bit of money. So I think that's a great illustration of how proactive management saves money, protects the environment, and really creates a better scenario. So it's not like the Forest Service isn't trying, but when they refuse or they're not able to do management, we're going to see more of these catastrophic wildfires that are creating landscapes that are extremely hard and expensive to reforest.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that because the U.S. Forest Service firefighting budget has been was previously underfunded for decades, they had to borrow from their proactive management of forest management and forest restoration to help fight fires.
Right, and we've got that part fixed.
Now that we fixed it, I think it's important for us to focus on that proactive management of forests.
Would anybody else like to add?
Maybe I can just add to your last point about utilizing the biomass that we're actually taking off of forests. The U.S. Forest Service Wood Innovation Grant is a really good opportunity to find productive and valuable uses for the biomass that we're taking off of our lands and put it to good use in our buildings, in our energy systems, and that's a really good opportunity to harness the economic benefits of forests while keeping good forest standing and hazardous waste off of those lands.
And it can also be used as feedstock in chemical processes to make things like biodegradable plastics. So I think it's important that we continue to fund research on renewable energy from biomass and on other products from biomass. But currently, the renewable fuel standard is set up with a bias towards biomass as a renewable fuel. And so I think it's important that Congress should remove barriers like that. Anybody else like to address that?
I think the key in policy design is to make sure that the policy is as neutral as possible toward how you get net zero emissions. And if sequester is the low-cost option and the policy embraces it, people will go there. And that's the kind of incentive you need.
In terms of California, I mentioned biomass as part of our renewables portfolio standard. It is a component in California. We also include natural and working lands as part of our portfolio approach. We are trying everything under the sun, and we are working with our sister agencies, the Natural Resources Agency and others who actually do the land management in California, to develop plans to augment the carbon sink of our state forests. We do have significant forests in California. Unfortunately, because of climate change, a lot of our trees are dying, but we are very much focused on utilizing that resource within the state to contribute to greenhouse gas reductions in the state of California.
And I would just say that, if the climate's changing, I think it's changing everywhere, and there are states that are promoting active forest management, like my state and most states across the South, where the increment of forest is gaining at a tremendous amount every year, while like in California, Colorado, then the amount of standing timber in those states is less right now than it was this time last year, while like in Georgia, there's 19 million more tons of trees in the state of Georgia right now than there was this time last year. So I think there's more we can learn from the science and make good policies that work all across the country. I could go on, but I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your extra time.
I think you used it very wisely. Now I'd like to recognize the ranking member, Mr. Gosar.
Thank you. Just one added aspect, Ms. Amador. I think doing the same thing we've done previously in our forest isn't working. And so we have to kind of go outside the box. I'm from Arizona, and we've had this problem time and time again. And so it's not just restoring money, it's actually restoring an industry that's been put out of business. So there's lots of technology that can actually biochar is another thing that's coming on or that's coming up the pipe, but we can't do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result. It doesn't work, and it hasn't worked. Dr. Holtz-Eakin, you discussed in your testimony that the focus in innovation strategy should be on new emerging technologies that will decrease the cost of low emissions energy production in developing nations. Why can't we achieve this goal with only existing wind and solar technologies? And what kinds of investments and research in new technologies should we be focusing on instead?
Well, I think we've seen quite rapid and beneficial improvements in existing wind and solar technologies, but the studies that I cited demonstrate how expensive reliance on those would be going forward. And so getting to the next generation, it seems essential. And in terms of the kinds of things to support, it should be the very early stage basic research, not end stage support for commercial technologies that are already out there. Business can take care of that. Leapfrog technology efforts at ARPA-E and in DOE and other places in the national lab system, I think should be the focus of federal funding.
So part of the problem with the wind and solar is it's intermittent energy.
Yes.
It's not a base load, and our grid doesn't function on these rolling escalates. It has to be a power grid that's even and equivocal across that grid.
That's absolutely right. We assumed some pretty favorable conditions in our cost estimates, and that they aren't very realistic. The cost of battery storage is a central issue in all of this. Sort of how are you going to be able to manage the load across time? What goes on in the transition from the solar to the wind as the sun sets and energy demand actually spikes? If you rule out using any fossil fuels, you don't have any dispatchable resources at that moment. You need to have a better battery technology than exists now at costs that are considerably cheaper. Those are sort of central issues in thinking about going forward.
Absolutely. The weakest part of the whole link is the battery storage.
Yep.
And it will be for some time. We don't foresee, in fact, that most investors, most technology believe that is the big holdup on that aspect. So, and when you start looking at the alternative with hydro, we're seeing lots of environmental applications to take down hydro. In fact, they don't even look at it as a renewable energy source.
Again, what we assumed was we used 100% of available hydro potential resources, and that's probably not realistic because there are pressures in the other direction. The same is true with nuclear. There are some plans which take that entirely out of the equation. That's an existing technology with zero emissions. Makes a big difference in the burden you place on the renewables, depending on how you configure those.
Yeah, I mean, Michael Schellenberger highlights that you cannot do wind and solar without having nuclear active. It's an impossibility. Ms. Amador, would you care to add anything to that technology discussion?
I think a lot of the members at this table would agree that innovation is an important step to really meet our mid-century climate goals. We sort of determine the art of the possible when we think about our research funding, but really that's not enough to get us to our climate goals. We really need to think about deployment support and initial financing support for technologies to help bring them from the lab to the market. I would add that Carbon 180 has also been supportive of traditional carbon capture as a way to decarbonize the power and industrial sector.
Dr. Holtz-Eakin, in your testimony, you mentioned global shortages of cobalt and how this would make lithium-ion batteries even more expensive going forward. In a premature or forced transition to net zero emissions, would we expect to see similar price increases and perhaps major shortages of other hard rock minerals used in renewable energy technologies such as copper, lithium, rare earth elements, and many others?
Yes, we'd have big stresses on the supply chains for the existing technologies if we rely on them and use them very rapidly in 10 years in my testimony. So, you know, you can reduce those pressures by stretching it out, and you can reduce them even more with new technologies that don't rely so heavily on those particular inputs.
So a dependable supply chain is very important in regards to those technologies. Would you agree?
Absolutely.
And the critical and rare earths, who controls that marketplace right now?
That'd be China.
Huh. Are those located in are those types of minerals located in the United States?
Yes, they are, but they're not currently commercially viable. They could be with some investment.
Why not?
We haven't had the market incentive to do so.
Could it be that China actually dictates the whole market?
That China has.
My understanding is that they keep their prices low and they continually raise them. We get speculation because it is much more expensive to do mining here in this country than anywhere else in the world, and we do it better than anybody else in the world. It reaches a platform in which they want to make the investment, and then what happens is the Chinese flood the market, basically taking the incentive out of that aspect. Would you agree to that?
I'm not an expert in rare earth economics, but that's a version of that I've heard many times.
So technology that I'm seeing, a lot of it is geared towards these rare or critical earths. So it seemed like it would be a national policy that we have state-of-the-art supply chains coming from this country. Would you agree?
That's a part of the strategy, but again, I'd emphasize, you should be also doing the research on technologies that don't rely on those so that you're not captive to those supply chains.
Would an incentive be like a prize? Set a goal and look for a prize. Would that be an incentive?
I'm a big fan of X-Prize-like structures. I think that's exactly the way we should do this. I'll note for the record, I proposed several of them in my career at the White House, and none of them made it through Congress. People like guaranteed money. They don't like having to work to get it.
Well, I saw an article that basically, Congress likes to see innovation, but then they regulate it out of existence. That's a problem.
And they don't like their constituents to be losers, and so there's enormous pressure to take the winner-take-all aspect out of those efforts.
I'll yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Kelly, in your testimony, both written and the oral testimony, that you indicated that even though companies don't have all the answers on how to achieve net zero emissions, they're still setting ambitious goals to do this. I'm concerned, I'm wondering, why are they doing this? And have there been any pushbacks from the stockholders in the boards? Because what they're saying is that this is an important goal of the company. And I'm wondering how effective that's been, and has there been any kind of pushback?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Actually, Ceres represents an investor network on climate risk that has over $22 trillion of assets under management. Those very investors are pushing companies repeatedly and have for the last 10 years to set goals, to make them public. They tend to set a North Star. They galvanize executives, external stakeholders. Companies have told me many times that it really mobilized them to meet their goals. And as you know, companies like Apple and Walmart have met their renewable energy goals. I think they also say there's enough that they do know. They know about the value of energy efficiency, as Hector noted. They know about the low cost of renewable energy. They're seeing the bottom line, and they're seeing cost savings. They, too, also believe in American innovation. And the discussion earlier about battery storage, let's not put any limits on how quickly we can make achievements in battery storage and in improved transmission. And I completely agree with investing in RPE. I mean, this is America. We can do this. If you look at any other aspects of innovation, look how quickly there was cell phone uptake. I mean, there are a million examples of our getting this right. So I think they have faith in American innovation, and mostly I think they have faith in you. They have faith that Congress will act, as we have many times historically, remove the barriers to the proper procurement of renewable energy, make the proper investments so that they can, in fact, help the economy to transition to a clean energy economy and meet their goals and surpass them.
Thank you. Mr. De La Torre, California has, we've talked here that one of the effective strategies will have to be, besides innovation and setting really targets, has to be at least, or some kind of regulatory process, has to also be a price of carbon. And California has elected to do a cap and trade program in that area of setting that price and dealing with it. Although we hear a lot of discussion also about just doing a carbon tax. Can you tell us what you see as some of the strengths and weaknesses of this that California has learned? Because is this a model that we should all be doing, the cap and trade kind of model, or should we be looking, as some have proposed, just more of a straight tax? And I think we're just here to listen and to try to understand what some of the differences are.
I think the three options in this area, and they're options that we considered in California, as you well know.
Yes.
One is just a regulatory cap. You set a cap and you bring it down over time and require people to hit that target. The second is a carbon tax, just a straight across the board tax with some dollar amount affixed to each emission or tons of carbon that are emitted. And then the third is cap and trade. In California, the reason why cap and trade was chosen as the option is because it was seen at the time as the least disruptive. And it works in conjunction with all the sectoral measures that I referenced in my opening comments. So the concept is you set a cap, but there's flexibility within that cap because you can buy the offsets. Clearly, the businesses in California and in Quebec are sibling in our cap and trade program. We've had other states that have been interested, by the way. They just haven't signed up, and to each his own and in their own time. But we expect that this mechanism will grow over time. Very important that our auctions, which happen 4 times a year for emissions allowances for those that go over their cap, the price has been fairly steady. It's been going up, but it's been fairly steady, nothing radical, so that there is certainty in the marketplace. In the secondary market, where businesses who bought those credits resell them, that price is much higher. And that tells me, and I haven't, this isn't CARB speaking, it tells me that there's real faith in the business community that California is committed, that this is a real mechanism for them to conduct their business in the state of California and Quebec, and that they will see benefit from this, and that there's value in it such that they're paying over a price that they can get in our auctions 4 times a year. So I think all of these signals are all heading in the right direction. Cap and trade is not perfect. There are communities who are negatively impacted by those emissions. So if you have a facility that is going over its cap by using allowances, they are emitting more, and those communities are impacted. We have other measures that we are using targeted to those communities in the state of California. We're taking those cap and trade dollars and reinvesting them in those communities to clean up other things in that community, transportation, et cetera, so that the net effect in the community is as close to the rest of the state as possible. So we are thinking about these other impacts to cap and trade. It's not a panacea. It's just one of the many mechanisms we use.
Thank you. Mr. Westerman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is kind of a treat getting to go a second round and quiz the panel more. I was thinking, and Ms. Kelly, you may be able to address this. How do we get everyone who's concerned about the environment and being good stewards, that are truly concerned about it, to get on the same page, kind of pulling the wagon in the same direction? Because what we see from a policy standpoint is there are well-intentioned policies that were put in place, policies like NEPA, like the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Air, Clean Water Act, that are good policies, but they're often weaponized and it does more harm to the environment than it does good. In this issue about critical minerals, in my district, I've got a couple of producers of it's brine. It's something not many people are probably even aware of, but it's a mineral-laden heavy water that can be pumped out of the ground, much like oil, but it's rich in critical minerals, and one of the things in that brine is lithium, and it's the world's second largest accessible deposit of lithium outside of the Dead Sea. But under current environmental laws, somebody could go after these companies and make it hard or too costly for them to produce lithium from that brine. There's a facility that's been shut down that's about to open back up that's going to produce vanadium. And if you read about battery technology for grid system storage, vanadium is kind of the key ingredient to that. But again, the environmental hoops that these companies have to go through and kind of the constant threat, it makes it difficult especially for smaller companies to get into any kind of business like that, but even for larger companies to stay in business. So my question is, how can we convince people of the bigger picture that critical minerals are required if you're going to build battery storage technology? There are a lot of protections in place through air permitting and water permitting to protect the environment and do this in a sustainable way. And it's much better here in this country than other places in the world where these minerals are produced. Would you care to address that?
Yeah, I so appreciate your question, because you're really calling on the better angels of our nature, as you say, to see the big picture. And there's no moment like this moment for us to put our controversies away and to go forward very quickly and understand that the things we agree on are much more important than those things on which we disagree. It's kind of a World War II moment. I'm struck, I've been an environmental lawyer now for 25 years, and I've seen lots and lots of battles over the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, RCRA, Superfund, hazardous waste. I used to do criminal enforcement. And far too often, these are pitched battles that have they're laden with political division. What strikes me at this moment is the stunning bipartisan, and sometimes I say post-partisan consensus on the need to address climate change. And to be specific, I'm personally struck by the consensus on the need to price carbon. And you see this across the spectrum. I've read Doug's writing for years. I know his friend, Bob Inglis, my friend, who said we need to start singing from the same hymnal. The details are important, of course, and we have to get it right. But I am struck that this moment gives us the opportunity to do what you're saying and to have a higher level conversation about real solutions in a short time frame that are actually going to get us there to solve this problem. So yours is one of many. I think we have colleagues in your state who'd be thrilled to come and do a roundtable discussion and try to hash this out. We have allies on all sides of the spectrum. And I think you're pointing to something very important that we can actually achieve.
Anybody else like to address that?
On the issue of lithium, we have significant geothermal resources in California, and we use it for power generation. But there is also an effort underway to try to extract lithium from these resources. The challenge is actually technological in California. I don't know about Arkansas, but It is very much a technological, it's just too intensive a process to extract the lithium from the brine. And so in the state of California, we have a number of companies, including Berkshire Hathaway is a major investor. They don't lack for resources. And they're having a hard time making this a credible concern. But we are looking, I just saw something within the last week, that there are efforts underway to make a technological breakthrough in terms of the processing of the brine, which would be a game changer for not just California, but I assume also in Arkansas. So it is a technological issue more than environmental, because the facilities are already there. They're using it for geothermal energy in California.
I'll yield back on this round. Thank you.
Dr. Holtz-Eakin, the conversation of carbon tax come up. You talked about this at length. Can you give us some indications if we don't get it right? What are the complications if we don't get a carbon tax right?
So not all carbon taxes are created equal, and I think it is important to look to the research literature in the economics of climate change, and if you go forward and do something like that, design it with the findings of that literature. So what does that say? It says, first of all, don't do two things. If you're going to have a carbon tax, you don't need a massive regulatory structure simultaneously, and that means you need to sort of take greenhouse gases out of the Clean Air Act, sort of the federal presumption of that, NEPA, Endangered Species Act, Clean Water Act. So there's a lot of regulatory underbrush that should be cleaned out to make the policy as efficient as possible. Second lesson of that literature is the notion that the most effective carbon tax is revenue neutral. You impose taxes on carbon and you relieve taxes on labor and capital. So imagine a payroll tax reduction tied to it, or a corporate tax reduction, some variety of things. Why do you do that? Number one, while you're raising the cost structure for firms, you're also lowering the cost structure by relieving those other taxes. So you don't, you allow the price signal to give firms the incentive to change the way they operate, become more efficient, greener in every dimension, but you don't depress overall economic activity. And indeed, that literature suggests that a well-designed carbon tax done in that way would have a de minimis impact, if any, on economic growth. The U.S. economy is, in fact, a very flexible, innovative, private sector-driven entity, and it will respond to those price signals effectively. And so how you do that does matter a lot.
Gotcha. I want to go back to the critical minerals again. I'm harping on this for a reason, is that, our framers actually looked at scientific discovery, those patents. It's a special place. And we've really kind of handicapped that in this country. We're no longer the #1 individual or country for patents. We see the market distorted. And if we want to create the incubator for this, you have to do several things. You have to provide an environment that is successful, that provides for success. That means you're given the tools, supply chains, innovation to bounce off of people, because it's not the government that creates the solution. It's the individual that creates that solution, and you bounce that off. And why I keep bringing that up is that we're tying our innovators' hands behind their back, because we have a supply chain that's here that's dependable, that actually gets people to buy into the aspect of trust is a series of promises kept. That's where we're missing the public, is that we're not showing them, listen, we stand on these principles, and we've rewarded you by actually showing you something that's actually occurred. So once again, we see this impetus to stop all types of mining for these critical minerals in this country. And I find it sad that particularly the other side has been noteworthy about trying to stop that. Now, to highlight something that Ms. Kelly said in regards to and response to Mr. Westerman. Isn't it funny that, we actually have the Center for Biological Diversity that actually files a lawsuit in court on facts that are now totally disputed. They stopped all conservation attempts in a number of forests in the Southwest, particularly citing the spotted owl habitat. Well, in the gentleman on Mr. Torre's state, we actually witnessed active tree management being done in habitat that is actually spotted owl. Actively done, but yet we can't do that over in Arizona. Number two is we feigned all thinning of the forest because they cite the spotted owl. Well, because we're not thinning the forest, we're predisposing a different owl over the spotted owl, the barred owl. This is what gets to us up here, is that we see these 23rd hour, 59th minute with a stamp, and we get a legal interpretation that is flawed scientifically. That's part of the problem here, is getting those innovative aspects here. Nobody wants to see the critters go away. No one wants to see degradation to clean air. No one wants to see any degradation to clean water. But it's that impetus that only government knows right. And I think there's a problem with that what we try to do is overreach. And instead, we look at the specifics to the overall good of what could transpire. You know, that's why one of the things that you'll see from the caucus that I had, the Western Caucus, is some reforms, is to include everybody, not just the federal government, but states, tribal, counties, cities, to get buy-in, because that's how you get stuff done. That would be my big aspect, is sunlight, and asking people to be incorporated, to be asked of their expertise, to be a part of a team is the best way to go. And I think we ask an awful lot, or we demand an awful lot, and we don't give people back that trust. Trust is a series of promises kept, and I think a lot of us need to go relook at that.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank the panelists for coming today. I think we've had a great discussion, but before you leave, one of the things I learned when I was the ranking member and Mr. Gosar was the chair was to, as we came to a conclusion, and I think it was a great idea, was to ask each of the panelists in maybe 1 minute or so to answer, was there something that you wish we had asked you, or was there something that you would like to convey after hearing this, just that you really haven't had the opportunity to do it? No pressure. If you feel like everything has been expressed, just leave it. But is there one thing that you want to tell us, or you wish we had asked you? Starting with Mr. De La Torre.
Well, we get in California quite a bit of cynicism, I think, from folks about why is California doing all of this? No one else is doing it. Why is the United States doing something? These other countries aren't doing it. And frankly, to me, that question doesn't get to the point. The only way we're going to make the change that we need is if we all do our part. And so I would just close with a saying that I cannot do all the good that the world needs, but the world needs all the good that I can do. And I think that's what California's attitude has been. And people are paying attention, and we see this with these foreign governments who come to California to look over our shoulder to see what we're doing, how we're doing it, and we never tell anybody how they should do their policy. We tell them how we do it, and then they will figure out what works for their constituents, for their states, for their countries, what's best for them. All we can do is share what we're doing, and we're going to continue to do that even as we hit every one of these targets, mostly ahead of time, mostly ahead of schedule. So it can be done. It can be done in an effective way. We can protect the environment and grow the economy, as I discussed in my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Amador, anything that you'd like to add to what you've said before you wish we had asked you about?
Yeah, thank you again for having me here today. I think this has been a really productive conversation, and we can all agree on the scale and importance of this challenge. One of the things that we think about at Carbon 180 is really how do we turn carbon from a liability to an asset? How do we store carbon in our forests to clean our air and clean our waters? How do we put carbon back into our soils to improve farmers' bottom lines and help them adapt to climate change? How do we store carbon in valuable products so that our cities become carbon negative while also providing jobs and economic opportunity? And so I think in order to harness that opportunity, the US federal government has a whole suite of tools to make that happen, and it's really time for us to take action today. We've seen a number of examples of where we can make progress today through research and development, demonstration, and deployment, and we've seen success already in renewable energy market penetration, and it's really about taking the full suite of solutions, taking action, and making our 2050 climate goals a reality.
Ms. Kelly.
Yes, thank you very much. I'd like to build on Representative Gosar's comment that I think is an important one, that the federal government doesn't always get it right. And yes, there's certainly regulatory underbrush that can be cleaned out, and the Endangered Species Act has certainly been a challenge to enforce. You are right that there are good ideas from cities and states and tribes and companies in states like California and Hector's colleagues and farmers who are getting at this and doing it seriously. I'm hoping you will ask me to bring those folks forward. Many of them are part of the We Are Still In coalition. They have good ideas, and they'd be delighted to come and talk to you and help you learn from their experience. You have tremendous convening power and authority, and I hope that you'll use it and bring in some of those bright minds so we can continue this conversation. And again, thank you for the invitation.
Dr. Holtz-Eakin.
Well, thank you for the chance to be here today. I'm very pleased to see the emphasis and focus on innovation. And certainly, harnessing market forces has been the most reliable and successful way to get innovation in the history of the globe. And for that to be effective, you need to have a stable policy environment that market participants can count on, risk capital can put money in, firms can make their plans. And so I'm really pleased personally to see the bipartisan atmosphere on this committee. I hope that's how this can be conducted throughout, so that there is agreement and stability in what we ask every actor in the private market to do.
Thank you. And with that, I believe this committee will be adjourned. This committee is adjourned.